The darkness of the basement archive at Blackwood Historical Society was almost complete, save for the small cone of light from Dr. Eleanor Hayes's desk lamp. Outside, rain lashed against the small windows near the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room filled with boxes of forgotten memories. Eleanor's fingers, protected by thin cotton gloves, carefully lifted the brittle photograph from its acid-free envelope. "This is it," she whispered to herself, placing the sepia-toned image under the soft light. Blackwood Orphanage, September 15, 1901. The photograph showed a Victorian building, imposing and austere, with 3 rows of children and staff arranged in front of it. Eleanor had been researching the abandoned building for months for her book on forgotten institutions of the early 20th century. This photograph was the earliest known image of the orphanage before its mysterious closure in 1902. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Professor Martin Collins, her colleague at Westfield University. "Martin, I found it," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "The 1901 photograph of Blackwood Orphanage. It was buried in the auxiliary archive, just as you suspected." "Excellent. Can you send me a digital copy? I'm especially interested in seeing if any of the staff match our list of suspected practitioners." Eleanor sighed. Martin's theories about occult practices at early orphanages were becoming an obsession. She preferred the historical facts, the documented evidence. Nevertheless, they had been working together for too long to dismiss his ideas outright. "I'll scan it now and send it over," she replied. "But Martin, remember, this is for the book. We need documented facts, not speculation. History is full of gaps, Eleanor. Sometimes we need to read between the lines." After hanging up, Eleanor carefully placed the photograph on the scanner. The image appeared on her laptop screen, the quality surprisingly good for such an old photograph. 42 children arranged in 3 neat rows, with 7 adults standing behind them, all wearing their Sunday best, faces solemn as was customary for photographs of the era. No one smiled in photographs back then. The long exposure times made holding a smile difficult, and Victorian sensibilities favored dignity over frivolity. She sent the high-resolution scan to Martin and began examining the details herself. The orphanage loomed in the background, a massive stone structure with narrow windows and a steep slate roof. The children's faces were a mixture of fear, resignation, and emptiness. Life in such institutions was harsh, with strict regimens and little affection. Her phone rang again. Martin, his voice uncharacteristically tense. "Did you look at the 3rd row? 5th child from the left?" Eleanor zoomed in on her screen. A girl of perhaps 10 years old, with dark hair pulled severely back from her face. Unlike the other children, who stared blankly at the camera, this girl's gaze seemed to be focused on something just beyond the photographer. "What about her?" Eleanor asked. "Not the girl. Look at the window directly behind her." Eleanor adjusted the zoom, focusing on one of the orphanage's ground floor windows. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just a dark rectangle against the gray stone. But as she increased the magnification and adjusted the contrast, something began to take shape within the glass. A face, pale, elongated, with hollowed eyes that seemed to stare directly into the camera. It was pressed against the glass, distorting its features in a way that seemed almost inhuman. "My God," she whispered. Is that a child?" "No child I've ever seen," Martin replied grimly. "I've run this through every enhancement algorithm I have. The more I sharpen the image, the worse it gets. Check your email." Eleanor opened Martin's message to find a series of enhanced versions of the window section. In each progressive image, the face became clearer, more defined, and more disturbing. The final enhancement showed a face that barely resembled anything human. Sunken eye sockets, an impossibly wide mouth, skin that appeared mottled and decayed. "This could be a photographic anomaly," Eleanor said, her academic mind searching for rational explanations. Early photographs had all sorts of exposure issues, chemical stains, across multiple enhancement algorithms. Martin interrupted, each designed to filter out different types of artifacts. "No, this is something else, and there's more. Look at the window on the top floor, far right." Eleanor's cursor moved to the indicated spot, zooming in on what appeared to be an empty window. As the image resolved, she felt her skin prickle. Another face, different from the first but equally disturbing, peered out from the shadows. "There are 7 of them," Martin said quietly. "1 in each of the visible windows. All different, all wrong." Eleanor sat back in her chair, the basement suddenly feeling much colder than before. "This doesn't make sense. These could be children looking out the windows. With those features, in those proportions. And why aren't they outside with the others for the photograph?" "No, Eleanor. Something very strange was happening at Blackwood Orphanage. Eleanor zoomed out, looking at the photograph as a whole again. The solemn faces of the children took on a new significance. Was that fear in their eyes? Knowledge of what lurked inside the building behind them? The orphanage closed unexpectedly in 1902, she said slowly. The official record cites structural concerns and insufficient funding, but I've always thought it was suspiciously sudden. 17 children disappeared during the closure, Martin added. The records say they were transferred to other institutions, but I've never been able to trace where they went. No receiving orphanage has any record of them. Eleanor stared at the photograph, at the faces in the windows that shouldn't be there, at the children standing rigidly in their rows. We need to look deeper into this, she said finally. Not just for the book anymore. I agree, Martin said, and I think we need to visit the site. The building is still standing, abandoned for decades. The local council has been debating demolition for years. I'll meet you there tomorrow, Eleanor decided. Bring all your research on the staff. I want to know exactly who was running that place. As she hung up, Eleanor couldn't help but look at the face in the window again. As a historian, she dealt with the past every day, with the echoes of lives long ended. But this felt like something reaching out across time, something that refused to stay buried. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the small windows of the archive basement. For a brief, terrifying moment, Eleanor imagined she saw a pale face pressed against the glass, watching her. But it was just the rain, distorting the light from the street lamp outside. Wasn't it? The next morning dawned gray and misty. Perfect weather for visiting an abandoned orphanage, Eleanor thought grimly as she drove through the winding country roads outside Blackwood. The old building stood on a hill overlooking the town, a silhouette of Victorian Gothic architecture against the clouded sky. Martin was already there when she arrived, his car parked on the overgrown driveway. He stood examining the facade, his camera hanging around his neck. It's exactly like in the photograph, he said as she approached. Barely changed in over 100 years. Eleanor looked up at the building. 3 stories of weathered stone, tall narrow windows, and a sense of foreboding that seemed built into its very design. Places like this were created to impose discipline and order, to remind their young inhabitants that life was harsh and charity came with strict conditions. Did you bring the photograph? Martin asked. Eleanor nodded, pulling out a protective folder from her bag. And copies of all the documentation I could find about the closure. There's not much. A few official notices, some correspondence between the Board of Trustees and the local authority. Nothing that explains what really happened. I've been doing some digging into the staff, Martin said, leading her toward the building. The headmaster was Dr. Augustus Blackwood. Yes, the same Blackwood who founded the town. He was a physician with some rather controversial ideas about child development and mental illness. They reached the front door, a massive oak affair with rusted iron hinges. It was secured with a modern padlock and chain, but Martin produced a key. The caretaker owes me a favor, he explained with a slight smile. We have 2 hours before he makes his rounds. Inside the orphanage was a tomb of dust and shadows. Weak light filtered through the dirty windows, illuminating peeling wallpaper and crumbling plaster. The entrance hall was grand, with a sweeping staircase leading to the upper floors and corridors branching off in different directions. The children's dormitories were on the 2nd floor, Martin said, consulting a floor plan he'd brought. Boys on the east side, girls on the west. The staff quarters were on the top floor. The ground floor had the classrooms, dining hall, and Dr. Blackwood's special rooms. Special rooms? Eleanor asked, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. His office, examination room, and what he called the correction chamber. According to his writings, he believed certain children possessed what he termed moral deficiencies that could be treated through his pioneering methods. Eleanor shuddered. Victorian psychiatric treatments were often little more than torture by modern standards. They moved through the ground floor, documenting the layout and comparing it to the photograph. When they reached what had been Dr. Blackwood's office, they found it surprisingly intact. A massive desk dominated the room, flanked by glass-fronted cabinets that once held books and medical instruments. Look at this, Martin said, pointing to a faded mark on the floor. A circle with strange symbols around its circumference. This isn't something you'd expect in a Victorian orphanage. Eleanor frowned. Could be added later by vandals or squatters. The symbols match those in Blackwood's private journals, Martin replied, taking photographs of the markings. I found references to his interest in what he called the science of the spirit. He believed orphan children were especially receptive to certain influences. They continued their exploration, moving upstairs to the dormitories. Long rooms with high ceilings, designed to hold 20 beds each, now empty save for scattered debris and the occasional rusted bed frame. The windows matched those in the photograph, tall and narrow, offering views of the countryside beyond. "This is where they would have slept," Eleanor said quietly. "Those children in the photograph, and possibly where 17 of them disappeared from," Martin added. "Let's check the third floor." The staircase to the top floor was narrower, the wood creaking ominously underfoot. The staff quarters were smaller rooms, more private but equally austere. At the end of the corridor was a locked door. "This must be Blackwood's personal quarters," Martin said, examining the heavy lock. "The caretaker said this door has always been locked, with no key in living memory." Eleanor examined the door frame, noticing small markings carved into the wood. "More symbols," she said, "similar to those in the office." Martin took out a small toolkit from his bag and began working on the lock. "Traditional locks like these are actually fairly simple to—" The lock clicked, and the door swung inward with a long, pained creak. The room beyond was unlike anything else in the orphanage. Where the rest of the building had been stripped bare over the decades, this room remained fully furnished as if preserved in time. A 4-poster bed with rotting curtains, a writing desk covered in papers, bookshelves filled with ancient volumes, and most disturbingly, glass jars lining one entire wall, their contents too clouded with age to identify. "It's untouched," Eleanor whispered. "After all this time." Martin approached the desk cautiously. "These papers, they're Blackwood's research. Look at the dates. The last entry is March 15th, a week before the orphanage was suddenly closed." Eleanor joined him, carefully examining the faded handwriting. The pages were filled with diagrams, notations in what appeared to be Latin and Greek, and detailed observations of individual children, identified only by numbers rather than names. "Subject 12 shows remarkable sensitivity to the boundary," she read aloud. "When placed within the circle, the subject was able to perceive the entities clearly, describing them in detail consistent with historical accounts. Heart rate elevated to dangerous levels but stabilized after removal from the circle. Recovery time, 3 hours. Longer than Subject 9, shorter than Subject 7. Martin had moved to the bookshelf, carefully examining the titles. "These are texts on occult practices, forbidden knowledge. Some of these books are extremely rare, works thought to be destroyed centuries ago." Eleanor continued reading the journal entries, a growing sense of horror building within her. He was experimenting on the children, using them to what? Communicate with something? "Not communicate," Martin said grimly, holding up a book open to an illustrated page. "Summon." Blackwood believed the barrier between our world and another was thinnest around those who had experienced profound loss and trauma. Orphaned children. Eleanor felt sick. That's monstrous, even by Victorian standards. "It gets worse," Martin said, turning pages in Blackwood's journal. "Listen to this. The breakthrough came yesterday. Subject 17 not only perceived the entities but served as a successful conduit. The exchange was brief but profound. They require a more permanent doorway, and in return, offer knowledge beyond mortal understanding. The 17 most receptive subjects will participate in the grand working on the equinox." "The equinox, March 21st, 1902, Eleanor said, 5 days before the orphanage was officially closed. They looked at each other, the implications settling heavily between them. Whatever Blackwood had planned for those 17 children, it had coincided exactly with their disappearance from the records. "We need to find out what happened on that day," Eleanor said firmly. "And I think I know where to look." She reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph again. "We need to identify the staff members. One of them might have left an account of what really happened." They spread the photograph on the desk, examining the 7 adults standing behind the children. Blackwood was easy to identify from historical records. A tall man with a severe expression and penetrating eyes, standing in the center of the group. "This woman on the far left," Martin said, pointing. "I think that's Matron Eliza Winters. She left the orphanage 2 days before the equinox, according to employment records. Moved to a town about 30 miles from here and lived there until her death in 1956. Did she leave any records? Diaries? Letters?" Eleanor asked, excitement building. A contemporary witness who had left before whatever happened on the equinox might be their best hope for answers. "Unknown, but we can find out. The local historical society there might have information." As they continued examining the photograph, Eleanor noticed something she'd missed before. "Martin, look at the children in the front row. Look at their hands." Martin leaned closer. "They're Making signs? Some kind of hand positions? Not all of them. Just 7 of them, spaced throughout the group. Eleanor counted again to be sure. 7 children making strange gestures with their hands. 7 faces in the windows. And 17 children who disappeared, Martin added. The numbers can't be coincidental. A sudden noise from somewhere in the building made them both freeze. Footsteps, heavy and slow, echoing up from the floor below. The caretaker? Eleanor whispered. Martin checked his watch. He's not due for another hour. The footsteps continued, moving deliberately through the building, then the distinct sound of someone, or something, climbing the stairs. We should leave, Eleanor said, gathering the photograph and her notes. Right now. Martin quickly photographed as many of Blackwood's papers as he could before following her to the door. The footsteps had reached the 2nd floor now, still climbing steadily upward. There's a back staircase, Martin whispered, pointing down the hall in the opposite direction from the main stairs. Service access for the staff. They moved quickly but quietly, reaching the narrow service stairs just as the footsteps arrived on the 3rd floor. Through a gap in the door, Eleanor caught a glimpse of a dark figure at the far end of the corridor, tall and unnaturally thin, moving with a jerking gait toward Blackwood's room. They descended the service stairs in near darkness, emerging on the ground floor near the kitchen. Without speaking, they made their way through the abandoned rooms to a side door, stepping out into the misty daylight, with a shared sense of relief. What was that? Eleanor asked when they were safely back at their cars. I don't know, Martin admitted. The caretaker said the place was secure, no squatters or vandals. He checks it twice daily. Eleanor looked back at the orphanage, its windows dark and empty. Or were they? For a moment she thought she saw movement behind one of the 3rd floor windows, a pale shape watching them leave. We need to follow the trail of Matron Winters, she said decisively. And we should digitally analyze the entire photograph, not just the windows. Those hand gestures the children are making, the positioning, it all means something. I'll run the enhanced image through some recognition software I have access to, Martin agreed. Those symbols might match known occult patterns. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor had one more thought. The town records from 1902 might have more information about the closure. Newspaper accounts, local gossip. People must have noticed when 17 children vanished, regardless of the official explanation. I'll meet you at the Blackwood Town Archives tomorrow morning, Martin said. And Eleanor, be careful. I have a feeling we've stirred up something that's been waiting a very long time to be discovered. As Eleanor drove away, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, not just from the orphanage, but from somewhere much closer. In her rearview mirror, the building receded into the mist, its windows like empty eyes following her departure. The Blackwood Town Archives were housed in the basement of the public library, a modest building that had served the community since 1923. Eleanor arrived early, hoping to get a head start on the research before Martin joined her. The archivist, a helpful elderly woman named Mrs. Pembroke, seemed excited to have a professional historian interested in local history. We don't get many visitors to the archives, she explained, leading Eleanor through the rows of filing cabinets and bookshelves. Most people nowadays just want to look up their family trees online, not dig through old papers. I'm interested in the Blackwood Orphanage, Eleanor explained, specifically events surrounding its closure in 1902. Mrs. Pembroke's smile faltered slightly. Oh, that old place. Nasty business that was, even after all these years. People still talk about it in whispers. Eleanor's interest piqued. What do they say? The archivist glanced around, though they were alone in the basement. Just old stories, you understand. About children crying in the night when no children are there. Lights in the windows of a building with no electricity. That sort of thing. And what about the closure itself? Do the archives have newspaper accounts from that time? Mrs. Pembroke nodded. The Blackwood Gazette has been in print since 1890. We have bound copies of all issues. March 1902 would be in Cabinet 7, Section C. Eleanor thanked her and began her search. The Gazette had been a weekly publication in 1902, and she quickly found the relevant issues. The March 28 edition featured a small article about the orphanage's closure, citing structural concerns and noting that all residents have been safely relocated to appropriate facilities. No mention of exactly where the children had been sent. No names, no follow-up stories in subsequent issues. She was still examining the newspapers when Martin arrived, looking tired and excited simultaneously. I was up all night with the photograph, he said without preamble. The hand gestures the children are making. They're not random. They form a pattern, a ritual pattern. When mapped against their positions in the rows, They create a specific geometric shape. He laid a transparent overlay on top of a copy of the photograph. The lines connecting the 7 children formed a 7-pointed star. A septagram, Eleanor murmured, and the faces in the windows are positioned at each point where the lines intersect with the building. Martin finished. It can't be coincidence. Eleanor showed him the newspaper article about the closure. Not much here, but Mrs. Pembroke mentioned nasty business and local legends about the building. I found something else, Martin said, lowering his voice. I identified Matron Winters and tracked down her granddaughter, still living in Crescent Hill, where Winters relocated after leaving the orphanage. She has her grandmother's diaries and agreed to let us see them this afternoon. That's excellent work, Eleanor said, impressed. But first, I want to check the town council minutes from that period. If the orphanage was closed for structural reasons, there should be inspection reports, discussions about the children's relocation. They spent the morning poring over dusty, minute books and correspondence files, finding disturbingly little about such a significant local institution. It was as if the orphanage had been deliberately scrubbed from official records, reduced to brief mentions and vague references. The most substantial find came just before lunch. A sealed envelope marked Blackwood Orphanage Final Report, tucked inside a folder of miscellaneous documents from 1902. The seal had yellowed with age but remained unbroken. Should we open it? Martin asked, examining the official town council stamp on the envelope. It's been sealed for over 120 years, Eleanor replied. But it's a historical document in a public archive. We have every right to access it for research purposes. Carefully, she broke the seal and extracted several sheets of heavy paper covered in formal handwriting. The report was signed by Mayor Harold Winters, a relation of the matron perhaps, and dated March 27, 1902. To the permanent record of Blackwood Town Council, Eleanor read aloud. It is with solemn duty that I document the final resolution of matters pertaining to the Blackwood Orphanage, heretofore struck from public record by unanimous vote of the Emergency Council meeting of March 22, 1902. She and Martin exchanged glances before she continued reading. The events of March 21st have been contained to the best of our ability. Dr. Augustus Blackwood has been remanded to Greenwold Asylum under continuous guard and restraint. The remains of staff members Collins, Harding, and Fletcher have been interred in consecrated ground with appropriate rites. As for the 17 children involved in the incident, all efforts to locate them have proven futile. The building has been secured according to Reverend Moore's specifications, with appropriate barriers and seals placed at all entrances and windows. Eleanor paused, her hands trembling slightly. Remains of staff members, and the 17 children just gone? Martin urged her to continue. It is the recommendation of this office that the Blackwood Orphanage remain sealed and undisturbed in perpetuity. The surviving children have been relocated to institutions outside the county, with strict instructions that they never return to Blackwood. Matron Winters has provided a full account of the practices she observed prior to her departure, which has been sealed separately and placed in the custody of Reverend Moore's successor, to be maintained by the church in secrecy. The church, Martin said, St. Michael's in the town center. If Reverend Moore's account was passed down, we should finish this first, Eleanor insisted, turning to the final page of the report. Let this stand as the only official record of these events. Public knowledge would serve no purpose but to spread fear and invite the morbidly curious to tamper with that which must remain undisturbed. The 17 may be beyond our help, but we can prevent others from sharing their fate. May God have mercy on those of us who failed to recognize the evil in our midst until it was too late. Harold Winters, Mayor of Blackwood. Eleanor carefully returned the document to its envelope. We need to see Matron Winters' diaries now, and then find out if St. Michael's Church still has the sealed account. The current reverend might not even know it exists, Martin pointed out. These kinds of secrets get lost over generations. Then we'll have to convince them to look, Eleanor said firmly. But first, let's see what the matron knew. The drive to Crescent Hill took just under an hour. It was a smaller town than Blackwood, quieter and seemingly untouched by the passage of time. Patricia Summers, the granddaughter of Eliza Winters, lived in a small cottage on the outskirts, surrounded by a well-tended garden. She was a sprightly woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes that assessed them carefully as she invited them inside. You're the historians researching Blackwood Orphanage, she said, not quite a question. Grandmother never spoke of that place willingly. Only in her diaries did she reveal what she had witnessed. She led them to a sitting room, where a small wooden box rested on a side table. These are her private journals from 1900 to 1910. The relevant entries are in the first volume. but you may read them all if it helps your research." Eleanor thanked her, handling the worn leather journal with reverence. "Did your grandmother ever tell you anything directly about the orphanage?" Patricia's expression darkened. "Only once, when I was about 12. I found an old photograph in her things. Not the one you've discovered, but a smaller one, of just her and some of the children. When I asked about it, she became very upset. She told me to put it away and never to speak of that place again. Then she said something I never forgot. Some of those children weren't children at all, not anymore." Martin leaned forward. "Did she explain what she meant by that?" "No. She refused to say another word on the subject. But that night, I heard her praying in her room, asking God to keep them contained, to prevent them from finding others." Patricia shook her head. "I was frightened enough never to mention it again." Eleanor opened the journal carefully, finding the entries for early 1902. Eliza Winters had neat, precise handwriting, filling each page with detailed observations. Most entries concerned mundane matters: children's behavior, staff schedules, supply inventories. But beginning in January 1902, a new thread emerged. January 15th, 1902, Eleanor read, "Dr. Blackwood has selected 17 children for his special studies. They are removed from regular classes 3 times weekly for what he terms therapeutic sessions. They return subdued and often confused. When questioned, they cannot recall what occurs during these sessions. Young Thomas drew strange symbols in his porridge this morning, though he seemed unaware of doing so." She turned the page. January 29th, 1902. Found Dr. Blackwood and Mr. Collins in the basement after hours. They had drawn an elaborate pattern on the floor and placed candles at various points. Dr. Blackwood claimed it was an experimental treatment room for children with nervous conditions. I do not believe him, but my position prevents me from questioning his methods directly. Martin made notes as Eleanor continued reading aloud the increasingly disturbing entries. By March, Matron Winters was documenting strange occurrences throughout the orphanage. Children speaking in languages they couldn't possibly know, windows that wouldn't stay closed, unexplained cold spots, and strange figures glimpsed in mirrors and darkened corridors. March 18th, 1902, Eleanor read, her voice now barely above a whisper. "I can no longer ignore what is happening. Last night I observed Dr. Blackwood leading the 17 children to the basement. I followed at a distance and witnessed something I cannot fully describe. The children stood in a circle around a central point where something moved. It had no definite shape, but it was there, emerging from what appeared to be a tear in the very air itself. The children were chanting in unison, their voices not their own. When it reached toward one of them, little Sarah, I could remain silent no longer and called out. Dr. Blackwood was furious, ordering me to leave immediately. I saw hatred in his eyes, but also fear. He knows he cannot control what he is calling forth." March 19th, 1902. "I have made my decision. I cannot in good conscience remain at Blackwood Orphanage. I have written to my cousin Harold, the mayor, detailing what I have witnessed. I will leave tomorrow, though it pains me to abandon the children. But I fear that by the equinox, it will be too late for intervention. May God forgive me for not acting sooner." That was the final entry regarding the orphanage. The next, dated April 2nd, simply stated, "News from Blackwood. It is as I feared. The 17 are gone. Harold has done what he can to contain it, but I know in my heart that some evils cannot truly be contained, only temporarily bound." Patricia watched their faces as they finished reading. Now you understand why grandmother never spoke of it. Who would believe such things? Even in her diaries, she couldn't bring herself to fully describe what she saw. "Did she ever mention what happened to Dr. Blackwood?" Martin asked. "Only that he died in the asylum within a year. According to family stories, he was found in his cell one morning, every inch of his skin covered in tiny, precise symbols carved into his flesh. No one ever determined how he managed it while restrained and under constant observation." Eleanor closed the journal carefully. "Thank you for sharing this with us, Mrs. Summers. It helps fill in some significant gaps in our research. May I ask what you intend to do with this information?" Patricia asked, her expression concerned. Grandmother believed that attention to these events could reawaken what was barely contained. "We're historians," Eleanor assured her. "Our goal is to document and understand, not to interfere or disturb." As they prepared to leave, Patricia held Eleanor's arm gently. "The photograph you discovered, the one with the faces in the windows, grandmother had a name for them in her prayers. She called them the waiting ones. She believed they were still there, in the orphanage, waiting for someone to complete what Blackwood started. The drive back to Blackwood was silent, both Eleanor and Martin absorbed in their thoughts. The implications of Matron Winter's account were difficult to process within their academic frameworks. Eleanor had always prided herself on her rational approach to history, on finding the documented facts behind legends and folklore. But the evidence they'd uncovered pointed to something beyond conventional historical explanation. "We need to see if St. Michael's still has Reverend Moore's sealed account," Martin said as they entered the town limits. "It's the missing piece." St. Michael's Church was a modest stone building in the center of Blackwood, its spire visible from most parts of the small town. The current reverend, a young woman named Sarah Chen, greeted them with polite curiosity when they explained their research. "The church archives go back to the founding of Blackwood," she confirmed, leading them to her office. "Though I must admit, I haven't had occasion to explore the oldest records yet. I've only been here for 2 years." "We're looking for a sealed account left by Reverend Moore in 1902, Eleanor explained. "It would have been passed down from reverend to reverend, possibly with instructions that it remain sealed." Reverend Chen looked thoughtful. "When I took over from Reverend Phillips, he did give me a small locked box with some very old documents he said were church secrets. I haven't had any reason to open it." She unlocked a cabinet and removed a wooden box about the size of a large book, its surface darkened with age. A small brass lock secured the lid. "Do you have the key?" Martin asked. "Reverend Phillips gave it to me separately," she replied, retrieving a small key from her desk drawer. "He said I should only open it if directly necessary for the spiritual welfare of the parish." It seemed rather dramatic at the time, but he was quite insistent. Eleanor exchanged glances with Martin. "We believe the contents may be historically significant for our research on Blackwood Orphanage." Reverend Chen hesitated. "The orphanage on the hill? There are still older parishioners who cross themselves when it's mentioned." She made her decision, inserting the key into the lock. "As a custodian of history as well as faith, I think it's appropriate to examine what's been kept hidden for so long." The box contained several items: a small leather-bound book, a cloth pouch, and a sealed envelope similar to the one they'd found in the town archives. Reverend Chen handed the envelope to Eleanor, who opened it carefully. Inside was a detailed account written by Reverend Thomas Moore, dated March 23, 1902. His handwriting was hurried, the words occasionally blotched as if written in haste or extreme emotion. "I write this account in the aftermath of tragedy, so that those who come after me may understand the nature of what has been contained rather than destroyed, for destruction proved impossible." Eleanor continued reading aloud, the Reverend's account filling in the horrifying details of what had happened on the equinox. According to Moore, he had been summoned to the orphanage on the morning of March 22nd by a frantic staff member who had escaped the previous night's events. What he found defied explanation. 3 staff members dead, their bodies contorted in impossible positions, Dr. Blackwood in a catatonic state muttering in unknown languages, and no sign of the 17 children who had been part of what Blackwood called the Great Working. The building itself seemed changed, Moore wrote. Spaces that should have been solid appeared thin, permeable. Voices could be heard behind walls where no rooms existed. And in every mirror and window, faces watched, not the faces of the missing children, but something that wore approximations of human features like ill-fitting masks. With the help of Mayor Winters and several trusted men from the town, Reverend Moore had performed what he described as the ancient rites of binding and sealing at every entrance and window of the orphanage. The surviving children were sent away that same day, distributed among orphanages in distant counties with instructions that they never return to Blackwood. "The 17 are beyond our reach," Moore wrote in his conclusion. "Whether they were consumed, transformed, or simply taken, I cannot say with certainty, but they are gone from our world, while that which took them remains partially in ours, bound within the walls of that accursed building. The bindings will hold so long as the structure stands undisturbed and the seals remain intact. Should they be broken, what waits within will seek new vessels, new children to complete the doorway Blackwood tried to open." Reverend Chen had grown pale as Eleanor read. "This has been hidden in church records all this time, a binding ritual performed by one of my predecessors. It explains why the building was never demolished despite decades of debate," Martin said. "Someone in authority always prevented it, though they might not have known exactly why." Eleanor examined the cloth pouch from the box, finding it contained 7 small objects. Iron nails, each wrapped in copper wire and inscribed with tiny symbols. "The sealing nails," she murmured, recognizing them from Moore's description. He drove one into each entrance of the orphanage as part of the binding ritual. But if these are here, Martin began. Then they've been removed from the building, Eleanor finished, a chill running through her. When? By whom? Reverend Chen took a deep breath. Reverend Phillips mentioned something about this when he retired. He said the previous church caretaker had found some old iron nails in the church records and, not knowing their significance, had removed them during renovations about 10 years ago. Phillips was upset about it but said it was probably nothing important after all this time. 10 years, Martin said quietly. Has anything unusual happened at the orphanage in that time? There have been stories, Reverend Chen admitted. Teenagers who break in on dares, claiming to see things, strange lights. But that happens with any abandoned building, doesn't it? Eleanor wasn't listening anymore. She had pulled out her laptop and was searching through news archives from the past decade. Martin, look at this, she said, turning the screen toward him. 3 separate cases of missing teenagers in Blackwood in the last 10 years, all last seen near the old orphanage. The police concluded they were runaways, but none of them were ever found. 3 cases in 10 years, Martin said. That's statistically significant for a town this size. 7 missing in total, Eleanor added grimly. And there's more. Look at the dates. Martin examined the screen. March 21, 2021, March 24, 2023, and the most recent, March 21 of this year, all on the spring equinox. And all 17 years old, Eleanor whispered. It's happening again. Slowly, over time, but it's happening. 7 gone, 10 more to go. Reverend Chen looked between them, confusion and concern on her face. What are you suggesting? That some kind of entity is taking these teenagers? That's impossible, Eleanor finished. By conventional understanding, yes, but the historical evidence points to something beyond conventional explanation. We need to go back to the orphanage, Martin said suddenly. Right now. Today is August 18th, 7 months from the next equinox. If the pattern holds, whatever is in that building is preparing for another taking. Eleanor nodded, gathering their materials. Reverend Chen, thank you for your help. We'll return these items tomorrow, but right now we need to investigate further. Wait, the Reverend said, reaching for the leather-bound book that had been in the box. You should take this too. It appears to be Reverend Moore's private journal from that period. It might contain information about the binding ritual, how it was performed, how it might be reinforced. The orphanage looked different in the late afternoon light, more forbidding somehow. Dark clouds had gathered, casting the building in premature twilight. As Eleanor and Martin approached, a sense of wrongness seemed to emanate from the structure itself. The caretaker should be here, Martin said, noting the absence of any vehicle. He always does an afternoon check. Eleanor tried calling the caretaker's number, but it went straight to voicemail. No answer. Do you still have the key? Martin nodded, producing it from his pocket. As they reached the front door, Eleanor noticed something disturbing. A small hole in the doorframe where Moore's account had described placing one of the iron sealing nails. The seals were physical as well as spiritual, she said, pointing to the hole. When the nails were removed from the building and stored in the church, the binding began to weaken. Inside, the orphanage felt different from their previous visit. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. As they moved through the entrance hall, Eleanor could swear she heard faint whispers coming from behind the walls. We should check Blackwood's room first, Martin said. See if anything's changed. They made their way up to the 3rd floor, the whispers growing more distinct with each step. The door to Blackwood's quarters stood ajar, though they had closed it firmly upon their last departure. Martin pushed it open cautiously. The room appeared undisturbed at first glance, the desk still covered in papers, the bed with its rotting curtains, the bookshelves lined with forbidden texts. But as Eleanor's eyes adjusted to the gloom, she noticed something new. The circle on the floor was no longer just a faded marking. It had been redrawn, the symbols refreshed with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Someone's been here, she whispered. Recently, a sound from downstairs caught their attention. The front door opening, footsteps entering. They froze, listening intently. The caretaker, Martin suggested, but the footsteps didn't move like those of someone performing a routine check. They were deliberate, purposeful, moving directly toward the stairs. We should hide, Eleanor whispered, looking around frantically. Martin pointed to a small door half hidden behind a bookshelf, a servant's entrance or storage closet perhaps. They slipped inside just as the footsteps reached the 3rd floor, finding themselves in a narrow passageway that seemed to run between the walls. Through a crack in the door, Eleanor could see a figure enter Blackwood's room. It was a young man, perhaps 18 or 19, moving with strange, jerky motions. He approached the circle on the floor and knelt beside it, removing items from a backpack, candles, a knife, and what appeared to be old photographs. "That's Brian Winters," Martin breathed in Eleanor's ear. "The caretaker's nephew. He sometimes helps with maintenance." "Winters," Eleanor repeated, like the mayor and the matron from 1902, a family connection. The young man began arranging the candles around the circle, his movements becoming more fluid, more practiced. He spoke in a low voice, not to himself but as if conversing with someone unseen. "Yes, I found them," he said, placing the photographs at specific points around the circle's edge. "The original children, all 42 of them. It took time, but I found their burial records, their descendants. The connections are ready to be made." Eleanor strained to see the photographs. They appeared to be contemporary pictures of people of various ages, descendants of the orphans who had been photographed in 1901, she realized with growing horror. "The circle of blood is complete," Brian continued, his voice changing subtly, becoming deeper, older. "On the equinox, the 17 will return through their proxies, and the doorway will open fully. The waiting ones will finally cross completely into this world." He stood, turning slowly to face the hidden door where Eleanor and Martin concealed themselves. "And now, the final preparations can begin, with the help of our unexpected guests. Historians seeking truth, how appropriate that you should be the ones to witness the culmination of what Blackwood began." Martin pulled Eleanor deeper into the passageway. "Run," he hissed. "There must be another way out." They moved as quickly as they dared through the narrow corridor, which seemed to wind through the very skeleton of the building. Behind them, they could hear Brian forcing the hidden door open, his footsteps following at an unhurried pace, as if certain of their eventual capture. The passageway branched and turned, leading them deeper into the building's secret spaces. Occasionally, through cracks and gaps in the walls, Eleanor caught glimpses of empty rooms, corridors they recognized, but no clear way to reach them. "It's like a maze," she gasped as they paused at another junction, "designed to confuse." "This way," Martin decided, choosing the path that seemed to lead downward. "We need to get to the ground floor, find an exit." The passage narrowed further, the walls closing in until they had to turn sideways to proceed. The air grew colder, damper, suggesting they were approaching the foundations of the building. Finally, they emerged into a larger space. Not a room exactly, but a kind of chamber carved into the earth beneath the orphanage. The basement, Eleanor realized, but not the main basement, some kind of sub-basement. Their flashlights revealed a circular chamber with 7 alcoves spaced evenly around its circumference. In the center was a larger version of the circle they had seen in Blackwood's room, its symbols more elaborate, more complete. "This is where it happened," Martin said quietly, "where the 17 children disappeared in 1902. A slow clapping sound echoed through the chamber. Brian Winters stood in the entrance they had just used, his face transformed by a terrible smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Very good, Professor Collins. You've found the heart of it all. The exact spot where this world and the other touch most closely." He gestured around the chamber. "My ancestor, Mayor Winters, thought he had contained it with his seals and bindings, but blood calls to blood across generations. The waiting ones are patient. They've been collecting their 17, slowly, equinox by equinox. This coming March, the collection will be complete." "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're not Brian Winters." The young man's smile widened unnaturally. "I am many, a composite of those who wait. Brian serves as our voice for now, our hands in this world, just as you two will serve as our final keys." He stepped into the chamber, and as he did, Eleanor noticed something terrible. His shadow didn't match his form. It stretched and twisted along the wall, suggesting multiple figures moving in concert. "The photograph," he continued, circling them slowly. "You found it, examined it, drew attention to what had been forgotten. That was the beginning of the awakening. Each time someone looks at those faces in the windows, sees what waits beyond the glass, the barrier thins a little more." "The missing teenagers," Martin said. "You took them on the equinoxes." "Took them?" "No, transformed them, prepared them. Each one a vessel for one of the 17 who were interrupted in 1902. Blackwood nearly succeeded in opening the doorway permanently. He only needed a few more moments, a few more drops of innocent blood. But that meddling matron interrupted at the critical moment, leaving us caught between worlds, neither fully here nor fully there. Eleanor's mind raced through what they'd learned. The 17 children weren't victims. They were willing participants. Blackwood had conditioned them, prepared them. "Very good, Dr. Hayes," the thing wearing Brian's form said. They were special, receptive to the whispers from beyond. Just as their descendants are special. Blood remembers, you see. It carries echoes across generations. And the photos you've collected, they're of descendants of the original orphans. Martin realized. You're creating some kind of sympathetic link. The circle must be completed. The original 42 children, connected to their modern bloodlines. The 17 special ones, embodied in their descendants. And at the center, he pointed to them both. 2 scholars who sought knowledge regardless of the cost. Just like Blackwood himself. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. We're nothing like Blackwood. He experimented on children, sacrificed them for his own obsession. And you? Did you not pursue this mystery despite the warnings? Despite knowing that your attention, your focus, strengthened the connection? Every zoom, every enhancement of that photograph, every analysis of those faces in the windows, each one an invitation, pulling us closer to your world. The implications hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Their research, their examination of the photograph, their very presence in the orphanage, all of it had contributed to whatever was happening. "Why tell us this?" Martin demanded. "Why not just take us, like the others?" The thing in Brian's form circled the chamber, trailing fingers along the ancient symbols carved into the walls. Because knowledge is part of the ritual, understanding is part of the sacrifice. Blackwood knew what he was doing, embraced it willingly. Your participation must also be informed. Eleanor glanced at Martin, trying to communicate silently. They needed a way out, and quickly. Her hand closed around something in her pocket. Reverend Moore's journal, which she had been reading in the car. "The binding ritual," she said suddenly. "Reverend Moore performed it once. It can be done again." The creature paused, its borrowed face showing the first hint of concern. The old priest's magic was temporary at best, a delaying tactic, but it worked for over a century. Eleanor pressed. "It kept you contained, limited to whispers and shadows. The time for bindings is past," it hissed, Brian's voice overlaid with others, a chorus of whispers and snarls. "The door will open, the 17 will return, the 42 will serve as anchors, and you two." It smiled again, that terrible stretching of human features beyond natural limits. "You two will witness it all, with the eyes of scholars and the souls of sacrifices." It lunged forward suddenly, inhumanly fast. Martin shoved Eleanor aside, taking the brunt of the attack. They fell in different directions, Martin grappling with the creature while Eleanor scrambled away, clutching the journal. "Run!" Martin shouted, struggling to hold the thing that wore Brian's form. "Get out! Find help!" Eleanor hesitated for only a moment, before racing toward one of the other passages leading from the chamber. Behind her, she heard Martin cry out in pain, then a terrible silence. The passage she'd chosen sloped upward, twisting back toward what she hoped was the main building. Her flashlight beam bounced crazily off the narrow walls as she ran, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Finally, she burst through a hidden panel into what appeared to be the orphanage's main basement, the one they had explored on their first visit. From here, she knew the way out. She raced up the stairs, through the ground floor, and toward the main entrance. Outside, twilight had deepened into true darkness. Rain fell in heavy sheets, obscuring visibility beyond a few feet. Eleanor ran to her car, fumbling with her keys, desperate to escape and find help. As she pulled away from the orphanage, her headlights briefly illuminated a figure standing in the entrance. Brian Winters, or what remained of him, watching her departure with that same terrible smile. But it wasn't just one figure anymore. Standing behind him, visible yet somehow not fully there, were others. Pale, elongated forms, with 2 wide mouths and hollow eyes. The faces from the windows, now partly materialized in our world, and among them, his expression blank and his movements jerky and unnatural, was Martin. Eleanor drove recklessly through the rain, her mind racing faster than her car. She couldn't go to the police. What would she tell them? That an ancient evil was preparing to enter our world through an abandoned orphanage? That her colleague had been possessed by something from beyond reality? No, she needed someone who might believe her, someone who already knew part of the story. She headed for St. Michael's Church, praying that Reverend Chen would still be there. The church was dark when she arrived, but a light burned in the rectory next door. Eleanor pounded on the door, relief flooding through her when the young reverend answered. "Dr. Hayes? What's happened? You're soaking wet and—" Chen's eyes widened. "You're bleeding." Eleanor hadn't even noticed the cut on her forehead, likely from her scramble through the hidden passages. "Martin's been taken," she gasped. "And it's worse than we thought. Much worse." Inside, she told Reverend Chen everything. What they'd discovered in Blackwood's room, the hidden chamber beneath the orphanage, Brian Winters and his true nature, and finally, Martin's capture. "So these entities have been taking teenagers on the equinox," Chen summarized, trying to process the fantastic story, "using them as vessels to bring back the 17 children who disappeared in 1902. And they need descendants of the original orphans to complete some kind of ritual that will open a permanent doorway between worlds." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, "and they've been using our research, our focus on the photograph, to strengthen their connection to our world. Every time we examined those faces in the windows, we were essentially acknowledging them, inviting them in. And the next equinox, March 21st, 2026, is when they plan to complete the ritual." Eleanor nodded grimly. "With 10 more teenagers, plus Martin and me as some kind of central sacrifices. Brian, or whatever was using him, said we were like Blackwood, seeking knowledge regardless of the cost." Reverend Chen was silent for a long moment, absorbing the implications. "I should be dismissing this as impossible," she finally said. "But the evidence you've presented, the historical accounts, the pattern of disappearances, it's hard to ignore." "Moore's journal," Eleanor said, pulling it from her pocket. "I've only skimmed it, but it contains details of the binding ritual he performed. He didn't just seal the building, he bound the entities to it, prevented them from reaching beyond its walls, until the sealing nails were removed," Chen added, "allowing them to influence people like Brian Winters to take the teenagers on the equinoxes. We need to perform the ritual again," Eleanor said decisively. "Properly this time, with the original nails if possible. And we need to destroy that photograph, cut the connection it's creating." Chen looked doubtful. "I'm a modern minister with a theology degree, not an exorcist. I've never performed anything like what you're describing." "But you have faith," Eleanor insisted. Moore wasn't an occultist either. He was a man of God confronting something beyond his understanding. He found a way to contain it for over a century. We need to do the same. The Reverend considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's study the journal, understand exactly what Moore did, but we should wait until morning. Going back to that place in darkness would be foolish." Eleanor wanted to argue. Martin was still there in danger, but she knew Chen was right. They needed to be prepared, to understand exactly what they were facing and how to counter it. "First light," she agreed reluctantly, "and we'll need help. Someone who knows the building, who can navigate it safely." "I know someone," Chen said. "Harold Winters, the current one, not the mayor from 1902. He's the town historian, descended from the same family. If anyone knows the orphanage's secrets, it would be him." Eleanor felt a chill. Winters, like Brian Winters, like matron Eliza Winters, the same family that's been connected to this from the beginning. "It's a small town," Chen said apologetically. "Many families have been here for generations, but Harold is respected, trustworthy. He's in his 70s now, retired from teaching local history at the high school." Eleanor wasn't convinced, but they needed all the help they could get. "Contact him, but be careful what you tell him until we're certain he's not involved." As Reverend Chen made the call, Eleanor began studying Moore's journal in detail. The binding ritual he described was a combination of Christian prayers and what appeared to be much older practices, protective symbols, consecrated objects placed at strategic points, and the 7 iron nails, each driven into an entrance while reciting specific invocations. "The iron repels them," she murmured, reading Moore's observations. "The copper conducts the prayer through the building's structure. The 7 points create a barrier they cannot cross." By the time Chen returned, Eleanor had identified the key elements of the ritual. "We'll need to replace the 7 nails at the exact points Moore describes: the main entrance, the service entrance, the basement door, and 4 specific windows that align with cardinal directions." "Harold will meet us at the church at dawn," Chen reported. "I told him we were investigating historical preservation of the orphanage. He seemed eager to help." Eleanor nodded absently, still reading. "There's something else here. Moore mentions a focus of connection, an object that linked the entities to our world. For him, it was a book of Blackwood's, which he sealed in a lead box and buried beneath the church altar. Could the photograph be serving that purpose now?" Chen asked. "You said every time someone examines it, the connection strengthens." "Exactly. We need to neutralize it somehow." Eleanor looked up suddenly. "The digital copies too. I sent scans to colleagues, uploaded backups to my cloud storage. Can you delete them remotely? Eleanor was already pulling out her laptop. Some of them. I'll need to contact anyone I shared it with directly. As she worked, sending urgent emails with vague explanations about potential ethical concerns with the image, Chen prepared the items they would need for the morning. The original ceiling nails, holy water, blessed candles, and printed copies of the prayers Moore had used. Do you think this will really work? Chen asked quietly when they had finished their preparations. This is far beyond anything I was taught in seminary. Eleanor closed Moore's journal and met the Reverend's gaze steadily. I don't know, but I do know that something very real is happening at that orphanage. Something took Martin. Something has been taking teenagers every 2 years. Whether we call it supernatural, paranormal, or just unknown, it needs to be stopped. And if we can't stop it, if the ritual fails, Eleanor had been considering this very question, then we destroy the building, completely, salt the earth. Moore believed the entities were bound to the physical structure. If it's gone, that's a last resort, Chen said firmly. There are proper channels for demolishing historical buildings. Proper channels won't matter much if what's in that orphanage fully enters our world on the next equinox, Eleanor replied grimly. Dawn brought pale light and a cessation of the rain, though heavy clouds still hung low over Blackwood. Eleanor had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, her dreams filled with glimpses of Martin's blank face and those terrible smiles that stretched too wide. Harold Winters was waiting at the church when they arrived, a spry older man with bright eyes and a shock of white hair. He greeted Chen warmly and Eleanor with curious interest. So you're the historian who's been researching old Blackwood orphanage, he said, shaking her hand firmly. About time someone took a proper scholarly interest in the place. Too many ghost stories and not enough facts. That's always been the problem. Eleanor studied him carefully, looking for any sign that he might be influenced by whatever had taken Brian. But his eyes were clear, his manner open and enthusiastic. Mr. Winters, what can you tell us about the building's layout, particularly any unusual features that might not appear in the official plans? Harold's eyes twinkled. You mean the secret passages? Oh yes, I know all about those. Explored them as a boy, before the place was properly sealed up. My father showed me the hidden entrances, said it was important family knowledge, though he never explained why. Eleanor and Chen exchanged glances. And your relation to Brian Winters, the caretaker's nephew? Eleanor asked carefully. Second cousin once removed or something like that, Harold said dismissively. Family's been in Blackwood since the beginning. My great-grandfather was mayor back at the turn of the century. Harold, Chen said gently, we need your help with something important regarding the orphanage. But first, we need to know, have you noticed anything unusual about Brian recently? Any strange behavior? The old man's expression darkened. Truth be told, I've been worried about the boy. Used to be bright, interested in local history. Last few months he's been different, secretive. I caught him in the town archives once, looking through records of the old families. Birth certificates, death records, that sort of thing. When I asked what he was researching, he just smiled in this odd way and said he was completing the circle. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. Did he ever mention a photograph? An old one, of the orphanage from 1901? Harold frowned, thinking. Not specifically, no. But he did ask about the original orphans, whether any had descendants still living in the area. I told him most scattered after the place closed, but a few bloodlines remained in Blackwood or neighboring towns. Mr. Winters, Eleanor said, deciding to take a risk. We believe Brian may be involved in something dangerous connected to the orphanage's history, something your great-grandfather and Reverend Moore tried to contain in 1902. The old man went very still. You know about that? The binding? Chen leaned forward. You know about it too? Family secret, Harold said quietly. Passed down through the Winters line. Not the details. Those were kept by the church, but the knowledge that something had happened, something that must remain contained. Each generation was told to watch for signs, to alert the Reverend if anything changed at the orphanage. And did you? Eleanor asked. When the teenagers began disappearing on the equinoxes, Harold looked stricken. I tried. Spoke to Reverend Phillips after the first disappearance in 2021. He assured me the bindings were intact, that it couldn't be related. After the second incident, I was more insistent, but he was preparing for retirement by then, didn't want to delve into old superstitions, as he called them. The binding has been broken, Chen told him gently. The ceiling nails were removed during church renovations years ago. We believe something. Mom is using Brian to prepare for a ritual on the next equinox. The old man absorbed this with remarkable composure. I suspected something was wrong when they never found those teenagers. Too much like the old stories about the 17 who vanished in 1902. He straightened his shoulders. What do you need me to do? Eleanor explained their plan to perform Moore's binding ritual again, replacing the ceiling nails and neutralizing the photograph. Harold listened intently, nodding occasionally. The passages will be key, he said when she finished. There are entrances that don't appear on any plans. Ways to move through the building unseen. If whatever has Brian is watching the main entrances, we'll need alternative routes. Can you draw us a map? Chen asked. Harold did better than that. From his pocket, he produced a small leather notebook. My father's notes on the building includes all the secret entrances, the passages between walls and, he hesitated, the location of the chamber beneath the main basement, the place where it happened in 1902. Eleanor took the notebook with reverent care. You came prepared. When the Reverend called about historians investigating the orphanage, I had a feeling it might be time. The Winters family has carried this knowledge for generations, waiting for when it would be needed again. With Harold's help, they formulated a more detailed plan. They would enter through a hidden entrance on the building's east side, make their way to the 7 key points Moore had identified, and place the ceiling nails while reciting the binding prayers. Finally, they would take the photograph to the chamber beneath the basement, where Chen would perform the ritual to neutralize its power. And if we encounter Brian, or others, Chen asked hesitantly. Iron repels them, Eleanor reminded her. We'll each carry an iron rod as protection. And salt. Moore mentions using salt lines as temporary barriers. Harold nodded in agreement. The entities can't directly harm those who don't invite them in. That's why they need vessels like Brian. But they can influence, manipulate, create illusions. What about Martin? Eleanor asked, the question that had been haunting her. Can we free him somehow? Harold's expression was grave. If he's been taken as a vessel, it depends on how complete the possession is. Moore's journal might have more information. They gathered their supplies, the 7 ceiling nails, iron rods, bags of salt, blessed candles, holy water, and copies of Moore's prayers. Eleanor brought the original photograph in a lead-lined box she had found among the church's artifacts. As they prepared to leave, Harold took Eleanor aside. There's something else you should know, he said quietly, about my family's connection to all this. Eliza Winters, the matron who left before the incident, she was my great-grandfather's cousin. But Augustus Blackwood was his uncle. The Winters family has blood ties to both sides of what happened in 1902. Are you saying your family has been watching the orphanage all these years because of guilt, responsibility, atonement? Harold corrected. My great-grandfather helped seal away what his uncle had unleashed. Each generation since has carried that duty. I failed when I didn't push harder after the first teenagers disappeared. I won't fail again. The orphanage loomed against the morning sky, its windows dark and watchful. No sign of activity, no sign of Brian or Martin or anything else moving within. But as they approached, Eleanor felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. Harold led them to what appeared to be a solid stone wall on the building's east side. Servants' entrance, he explained, running his fingers along the edge of the stonework until he found what he was looking for. With a practiced motion, he pressed a recessed stone, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. This leads to the kitchen area, he whispered as they entered. From there we can access the main building or the passage network between the walls. They moved silently through the abandoned kitchen, its iron stoves and work tables draped in decades of dust and cobwebs. Harold guided them to a pantry, then to a false back wall that opened into the passage network. These were built into the original design, he explained as they navigated the narrow corridors, allowed the staff to move throughout the building unseen by the children. Blackwood later used them for his experiments. The passages were like a maze, branching and turning in seemingly random patterns. Without Harold's guidance, Eleanor knew they would have been hopelessly lost within minutes. They emerged occasionally into main areas of the orphanage to place the ceiling nails at Moore's designated points. Chen reciting the binding prayers in a clear, steady voice despite her obvious fear. 4 nails placed, 3 to go. They had encountered no resistance, seen no sign of Brian or Martin or the entities that had taken them. The orphanage was silent save for their own cautious movements and the occasional groan of the old structure settling. Too easy, Eleanor murmured as they re-entered the passage network after placing the 4th nail. They must know we're here. They're watching, Harold confirmed grimly. Waiting. They can't directly interfere with the ritual unless we allow them to. But once we reach the chamber, that's their domain. Their power is strongest there. The fifth nail went into the frame of a north-facing window on the second floor. The sixth at the service entrance to the basement. Only one remained, the main entrance, where the first of Moore's nails had been removed. As they approached the grand entrance hall through the passages, Harold suddenly stopped. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "Listen." At first, Eleanor heard nothing. Then, faintly, a sound reached them. Children's voices, singing a strange, atonal melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "An illusion," Chen said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Remember what Harold said. They create illusions, manipulate perceptions." They emerged from the passage into the entrance hall, and the singing grew louder, more distinct. The hall itself appeared transformed, no longer abandoned and decaying, but restored to its Victorian glory. Gaslight flickered in wall sconces, illuminating polished floors and fresh paint. And there, arranged in 3 perfect rows before the main door, stood the children from the photograph. 42 solemn faces, their forms translucent, flickering like candle flames in a draught. "Ignore them," Harold commanded, though his own face had gone pale. "They're not real. Focus on the task." Chen moved forward with the 7th nail, approaching the massive front door where a small hole marked its original placement. The ghostly children watched silently, their singing faded to a whisper. As Chen raised the nail and began the final prayer, the main door swung open. Brian Winters stood on the threshold, but he was changed. His form seemed fluid, features shifting subtly from moment to moment, as if multiple faces were trying to emerge from his skin. "The binding will not hold this time," he said, his voice a chorus of overlapping tones. "The doorway is already opening. Can't you feel it?" Behind him, more figures appeared, teenagers with blank expressions and jerky movements. 7 of them, each with something subtly wrong about their appearance, their proportions, the way they held themselves. The missing ones, Eleanor realized. And among them, Martin, his eyes now hollow and his smile stretching unnaturally wide. "Martin," Eleanor called out. "If you can hear me, fight it." Martin's head tilted at an impossible angle. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice not his own. "Your colleague is with us now, as you will be, as all will be when the circle is complete." Chen continued the binding prayer, her voice rising above the whispers and the strange singing, the nail poised to drive into the doorframe. Brian's form rippled with fury. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he snarled. "The 17 are returning. The 42 will serve as anchors. The circle will be complete." "Now!" Harold shouted, throwing a handful of salt in an arc before the doorway. The entities hissed as one, unable to cross the temporary barrier. Chen drove the nail home with a single blow, the final words of the prayer echoing through the entrance hall. A shockwave seemed to pulse through the building, and the illusion of Victorian splendor shattered like glass, returning the hall to its true state of abandonment and decay. Brian and the possessed teenagers staggered backward, forced away from the entrance by the power of the completed binding. But instead of dispersing, they regrouped, their movements becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. "The photograph," Eleanor reminded them. "We still need to neutralize it in the chamber." Harold nodded, leading them back into the passage network. "There's a direct route to the sub-basement. We'll avoid them entirely." But as they navigated the narrow corridors, Eleanor heard the singing again, closer now, coming from within the walls themselves. The passages, once their protection, had become a hunting ground. "They're in the network," Harold whispered urgently. "We need to move faster." They hurried through the labyrinth, the singing growing louder, the air growing colder. At one junction, Eleanor glimpsed movement ahead, pale faces with 2 wide mouths, pressing through the very walls as if the solid matter was becoming permeable. "This way," Harold directed, taking a different turn. Almost there, the passage ended at a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. They descended carefully, the iron rods held before them like talismans. At the bottom, a small door opened directly into the circular chamber Eleanor had discovered with Martin. The chamber had changed. The circle in the center glowed with a faint, sickly light. The 7 alcoves around the perimeter now held candles, their flames an unnatural blue. And on the far side, a figure waited. Not Brian or any of the possessed teenagers, but something else. Something that only approximated human form. Its proportions wrong. Its features fluid and indistinct. "Augustus Blackwood, I presume," Harold said, his voice remarkably steady. "Or what remains of him." The figure inclined what passed for its head. "Harold Winters," it replied. its voice a dry whisper like old papers rustling. "The last of the bloodline. How fitting that you should be here at the culmination." "We've replaced the seals," Chen declared, stepping forward with more courage than Eleanor had expected. "The binding is restored. You cannot leave this place." The thing that had been Blackwood made a sound like cracking ice. Laughter, Eleanor realized with a chill. "The binding contains our physical manifestation, yes, but the doorway grows nonetheless. Each mind that comprehends our existence, each eye that perceives our image, each scholar who studies our nature, all strengthen the connection." It gestured to the walls, where Eleanor now noticed photographs pinned in precise patterns. Modern photos of people of various ages, mixed with copies of the original orphanage photograph. Each modern image had a name written beneath it in what looked like blood. "The descendants," Eleanor breathed, understanding. "You've identified descendants of all 42 original orphans. The bloodlines remember," the thing confirmed. "Even diluted through generations, they respond to our call. On the equinox, they will gather, drawn by dreams and compulsions they cannot understand. The 17 vessels will receive those who were interrupted in 1902. The 42 will form the anchor points, and the circle will finally close." Eleanor pulled the lead box containing the original photograph from her bag. "Not if we break the connection first." The chamber trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. The thing that had been Blackwood rippled with what might have been fear. "You cannot destroy it," it hissed. "The image exists in too many forms now. Too many minds have seen it. The connection is beyond physical objects." "Perhaps," Chen said, taking the box from Eleanor and approaching the circle. "But Moore's journal described how to sever the primary focus. The physical anchor can still be neutralized." She opened the box, removing the photograph. The faces in the windows seemed more distinct now, more present, as if looking out from the paper itself rather than merely being captured in the image. The chamber door burst open, and Brian entered, followed by Martin and the possessed teenagers. They moved in unison now, a coordinated organism rather than separate entities. "Stop them," the Blackwood thing commanded. "The ritual cannot be interrupted again." Harold stepped forward, iron rod raised. "Focus on the ritual," he told Chen. "We'll hold them off." Eleanor joined him, her own rod at the ready. The possessed advanced cautiously, wary of the iron but determined. Chen began reciting the neutralization ritual from Moore's journal, placing the photograph in the center of the glowing circle. "Blood of the family that bound you," she intoned, producing a small vial, "freely given to renew the barrier." Harold had provided the blood earlier, a small sacrifice from the family that had been connected to this mystery from the beginning. Chen poured it over the photograph, which began to smoke and curl at the edges. The possessed howled in unison, a sound of rage and frustration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They surged forward, no longer cautious. Eleanor and Harold struck out with the iron rods, forcing them back temporarily, but they were outnumbered. Martin lunged at Eleanor, his movements unnaturally fast. She swung the rod, connecting with his arm. He recoiled, hissing in pain, but pressed forward again. In his eyes, Eleanor caught a glimpse of recognition, of the real Martin fighting against whatever controlled him. "Martin," she gasped as they struggled. "Fight it! You're stronger than they are." For a moment, his movements faltered, his expression flickering between the terrible smile and his true self. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice his own again for just an instant. "Destroy it. Destroy everything." Then the moment passed, and the thing controlling him reasserted its dominance. He threw her aside with inhuman strength, sending her crashing into one of the alcoves. Harold was similarly overwhelmed, the possessed teenagers pinning him against the wall while Brian approached Chen, who was still reciting the ritual over the smoking photograph. "Enough," the Blackwood thing declared. "The binding is restored, but the doorway remains. We will simply wait, as we have waited before. Time means nothing to us. Eventually, the seals will fail again. Eventually, the photograph will be rediscovered. Eventually, the circle will close." "Not if there's nothing left to wait in," Eleanor said, struggling to her feet. From her pocket, she produced what they had prepared as a last resort, a small incendiary device, powerful enough to collapse the chamber and possibly the entire orphanage above it. The Blackwood thing recoiled. "You would not. The vessels, your colleague, the others, they would be destroyed as well." "Better that than what you have planned for them," Eleanor replied grimly. "Better than what you have planned for all of us." Chen completed the ritual, the photograph now fully engulfed in blue flame. The possessed staggered, momentarily weakened by the severing of the primary connection. Martin fell to his knees, his true self briefly resurfacing. "Do it," he gasped, fighting for control of his own voice. "End it, Eleanor. Please." The Blackwood thing surged forward, its form expanding, becoming less human, more its true self. A writhing mass of darkness and angles that hurt the eye to perceive directly. "You will join us," it hissed, reaching for Eleanor with limbs that seemed to bend in impossible ways. "You will witness the opening of the doorway from within." "Harold!" Eleanor called, tossing the device to the old man. "Finish it!" Harold caught the device, understanding in his eyes. "For my family's atonement," he said quietly. Then to Chen, "Run! Get her out of here!" Chen grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her toward the passage they had entered through. Behind them, Harold activated the device and threw it directly into the heart of the circle where the photograph still burned with supernatural flame. The possessed howled again, this time in genuine fear. They surged toward Harold, but it was too late. The Blackwood thing reached for the device, its form distorting as it tried to contain the imminent explosion. Eleanor and Chen raced through the passage, climbing the spiral staircase as fast as they could. Behind them, a muffled boom shook the entire structure, followed by the sound of collapsing stone and wood. "Martin!" Eleanor gasped as they ran. "We left Martin. There was no choice," Chen responded grimly. "We have to hope that destroying the chamber freed him, or at least gave him peace." They navigated the passage network with desperate speed, dust and debris falling around them as the orphanage began to collapse from below. Finally, they burst through a hidden door into the main building, now shaking violently as its foundation crumbled. "The main entrance," Chen directed. "It's the shortest way out." They raced through the decaying corridors, dodging falling plaster and splintering wood. The entrance hall was before them, the massive front door their path to safety. As they sprinted toward it, Eleanor glanced back one last time. In the shadows of the collapsing building, she caught glimpses of pale faces with wide, empty mouths, their forms flickering like bad television reception. The waiting ones, still there but fading, their connection to our world weakening as their physical anchor disintegrated around them. Then she and Chen were outside, running down the overgrown driveway as the orphanage imploded behind them. A century of darkness finally buried beneath tons of stone and wood and earth. They didn't stop until they reached their cars, turning to watch as dust billowed from what had once been Blackwood Orphanage. Now only rubble remained, the imposing Victorian structure reduced to a pile of broken stone. "Do you think it worked?" Chen asked, her voice hoarse from exertion and dust. "Are they truly gone?" Eleanor thought of the photograph, burning with that strange blue flame, of Harold's sacrifice, of Martin fighting against the entity that had taken him even at the end. "The primary focus is destroyed," she said finally. "The building is gone. The physical anchors they needed no longer exist. Yes, I think it worked. And the copies of the photograph? The digital versions?" Eleanor had deleted everything she could access remotely, but copies remained beyond her reach. "They're just images now," she decided. "Without the original, without the physical location, they're powerless, just pixels and paper." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching as the dust began to settle over what remained of Blackwood Orphanage. "What will you tell people?" Chen asked eventually. "About Martin? About what happened here?" Eleanor hadn't considered this yet. The truth was impossible. No one would believe it. But she owed Martin and Harold, and even those 17 children from 1902, something more than a convenient lie. "I'll tell them we found evidence of criminal experiments conducted by Dr. Augustus Blackwood," she said slowly, "that the orphanage was closed to cover up his actions, that Martin and Harold discovered structural instability while investigating the site, which ultimately led to its collapse." She paused. "It's not the whole truth, but it's a truth they can accept." Chen nodded, understanding. "And the photograph? A historical curiosity, interesting for its composition, for what it reveals about orphanage conditions in the Victorian era. Nothing more." Eleanor looked back at the rubble one last time. Some knowledge is better left unexamined, some mysteries better left unsolved. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor thought she heard very faintly the sound of children singing. Not the strange atonal melody from the orphanage, but a simple, innocent song. A release, perhaps, an ending, or perhaps just the wind in the trees, signifying nothing but the passage of air over a place that would, with time, be forgotten once again. Months later, Eleanor sat in her office at the university, finalizing her book on forgotten institutions of the early 20th century. The chapter on Blackwood Orphanage was brief, factual, focusing on verifiable historical details, rather than the truth she and Chen had witnessed. Martin was listed among her acknowledgments, honored for his contributions to the research before his tragic death and the structural collapse of the abandoned building. Harold Winters, too, was acknowledged, a local historian who had provided valuable insights into the orphanage's place in community memory. Of the 17 children who had disappeared in 1902, she wrote only that incomplete records made it impossible to trace their ultimate fates. Of the 7 teenagers who had gone missing in recent years, she made no mention at all. The original photograph, she noted in a footnote, had been lost during the research process. No copies were included in the book. As she prepared to send the final manuscript to her publisher, Eleanor's phone rang. Reverend Chen calling from Blackwood. "They're clearing the site," Chen reported without preamble. "The town council finally approved the removal of the rubble. They're going to plant trees, create a memorial park." "Good," Eleanor said. "That's appropriate." "There's something else," Chen continued, her voice more hesitant now. "They found something in the debris, a metal box somehow intact despite the collapse. Inside was a journal, not Moore's or Blackwood's, but a new one. The handwriting." "Eleanor, it's Martin's handwriting." Eleanor felt a chill run through her, despite the warmth of her office. "What does it say?" "It's dated the day before we performed the ritual. It's addressed to you." Chen paused. He knew Eleanor. Somehow he knew what would happen. The last entry says, "If you're reading this, then the binding succeeded, but at great cost. Know that I made my choice willingly. Some doors must remain closed. Some knowledge must remain hidden." The photograph was just the beginning. There are others out there. Images, objects, places where the barriers are thin. Tell those who need to know. Warn those who will listen. The waiting ones are patient. They have eternity. We have only our vigilance. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, absorbing this final message from her colleague and friend. Then she made a decision. "I'm coming back to Blackwood," she told Chen. "There's an appendix I need to add to my book. Not about what happened, nothing that would draw attention or curiosity, but a warning, coded in academic language, for other researchers who might stumble upon similar discoveries. About the ethics of historical investigation, about knowing when to step back from certain types of knowledge." "Do you think anyone will understand the real message?" "Those who need to will," Eleanor replied. "As Martin said, we need to warn those who will listen." After ending the call, Eleanor turned back to her manuscript. On the screen was the final paragraph of her conclusion. "History is not merely a record of what was, but a living connection to those who came before us. When we examine the past, we reach across time, touching lives long ended, stories long concluded. In doing so, we must remember that not every story seeks continuation, not every door should be reopened. Some chapters of history are best left turned, some photographs best left unexamined, for in the spaces between what we know and what we seek to discover, there sometimes wait things better, left undisturbed." She added one final sentence. "And in those rare instances where the past reaches back toward us, we would do well to remember that curiosity, untempered by caution, may become the key that unlocks doors better left closed." With that, she sent the manuscript to her publisher, closed her laptop, and began preparing for her return to Blackwood. The orphanage was gone, the photograph destroyed, the immediate danger neutralized, but Martin's warning remained. The waiting ones were patient. They had eternity. All humanity had was vigilance, and the wisdom to know when not to look too closely at the faces watching from behind the glass.